In a quiet, unremarkable town, one school day began like any other, but that morning, something would happen that would change everything. A tragedy so shocking, so unimaginable, it would leave the entire community reeling. A 17-year-old girl, a student at the school, took a life, her teacher's life. But why? What drove Sarah Cooper, a teenager with her whole life ahead of her, to commit such an unthinkable act? What was it that pushed her to a breaking point where violence seemed like the only way out? Sarah was like any other student, at least on the surface. She wasn't part of the popular crowd, nor was she an outcast. She blended in. Quiet, reserved, she kept to herself. Yet beneath that exterior, a storm was building. A storm fueled by months, even years, of relentless torment. The bullying had been constant, like a slow drip of poison. It started innocently enough, snide remarks, little digs, but soon it escalated into something far more dangerous. The taunts, the whispers behind her back, the cruel jokes at her expense. Sarah tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself it was just part of being a teenager. But the cruelty didn't stop. It only grew worse. It wasn't just the students. No, the people who should have been her protectors, the adults in charge, turned a blind eye. Teachers, who were supposed to nurture and guide, were instead part of the problem. One teacher, in particular Mr. Richard Fowler, seemed to take pleasure in belittling Sarah in front of her peers. A joke here, a snide remark there. It all added up, until Sarah found herself trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. But then, something snapped. No one knew exactly when it happened, but Sarah reached her breaking point. That day, something inside her broke free. The girl who had always kept her head down, who had never caused any trouble, suddenly found herself standing at the crossroads of a decision no one could have predicted. A choice that would alter the course of her life forever. And when the dust settled, when the screams faded into silence, all that was left was the question. Was this an act of cold-blooded murder, or was this the tragic consequence of a system that failed a young girl who had no other way out? This is the story of Sarah Cooper, a teenager who was pushed to the edge, a student who fought back against a world that had broken her. But was she truly the villain in this story, or was she just another casualty of a broken system? Before we continue, please subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell to stay updated. Your support means the world to us, and we truly appreciate it. Thank you. Sarah Cooper was 17. At first glance, she was like so many other teenagers, caught between the chaos of high school and the uncertainty of what the future would bring. She was trying to figure out who she was, trying to find her place in the world, like everyone else her age. The pressure was constant, like a weight on her chest that she could never quite shake off. Her days were filled with schoolwork, trying to keep up with the endless assignments, projects, and tests that felt more like a gauntlet than a learning experience. And then there was the challenge of fitting in, the desire to be part of something, to feel seen and heard, not just like another face in the crowd. But for Sarah, fitting in seemed impossible. No matter how hard she tried, she always felt like an outsider, always just a little too different, a little too unnoticed. She was not the popular girl, the athlete, the social butterfly, nor the artsy outcast with a group of friends. Sarah existed in the space between these identities, a place where you're seen but never truly recognized, a place where you're invisible to everyone, even those around you. And the longer Sarah stayed in that in-between, the more the weight of her isolation grew. At first, it was easy enough to deal with. She spent most of her time lost in her books, quiet but content in her own thoughts. She had dreams, hopes, a quiet wish for things to get better. But that was before things changed, before she became the target of something she couldn't have predicted. Her classmates, the ones she passed in the halls and sat beside in class, they didn't notice her. They didn't care. They were busy with their own lives, their own dramas, their own worlds. But it wasn't long before Sarah became the subject of their whispers, their stares. She started to hear her name in hushed voices as she walked past groups of girls chatting by the lockers, their heads turning just a little too quickly when she entered the room. She could feel their eyes on her, even when they were pretending not to look. At first, the cruelty was subtle, almost imperceptible. Just a snide comment here, a quiet laugh there. It was easy to dismiss, Easy to convince herself that she was overreacting. They were just joking, right? It was harmless teasing, wasn't it? She tried to shrug it off, tell herself that it didn't matter, that high school was just a phase and that it would pass. But as the days went on, the teasing grew more frequent, more personal. The jokes weren't about generic things anymore. They were about her awkwardness, her clothes, her hair. And then, as if it was part of some cruel game, the taunts grew louder. Her classmates began to make her the punchline, the joke they all laughed at together, as if it was an inside joke that she would never understand. It didn't stop there. It never does. The cruelty, once subtle, morphed into something far more vicious. Whispers in the hallways turned into outright mockery. Social media became a battleground where Sarah was the target of anonymous cruelty. The digital age provided the perfect hiding place for her classmates to attack. They would post cruel comments, share images meant to humiliate her, write things that made her feel like she didn't belong in her own life. Freak, loser, ugly. Words that once seemed empty on paper now lived in her mind, echoing with every message, every comment, every stare. Her phone became a constant source of anxiety. Every time she checked it, she held her breath, wondering if this time would be different, if this time the messages might be kind or at least neutral. But they never were. The words cut deeper with every post, with every like on a cruel comment. What's worse, there was no escape from it. It followed her into every room, every corner of her world. The walls of the classroom, where she should have been learning, became an arena for ridicule. Sarah thought she could escape, that maybe in the classroom, the one place where authority should exist, she would be protected. But she was wrong. Her teacher, Mr. Richard Fowler, a well-liked and respected figure in the school, was supposed to be a mentor, a guide. But instead of offering her a safe space, he became one of her tormentors. At first, it wasn't as overt. He'd make a small comment here or there, like a joke no one seemed to mind. But then, things changed. Sarah's presence in his class became an opportunity for him to make her the butt of his jokes. He would single her out, mock her answers, belittle her when she was too shy to speak up. He was supposed to be the one to help her build her confidence, to support her when things were tough. But instead, he joined the others in breaking her down. His comments weren't subtle anymore. It wasn't just about her grades or her behavior. He began to mock her appearance, her quiet demeanor, and her inability to speak up in class. And the worst part was that the other students found it hilarious. They laughed, and the laughter was a slap to her face, a reminder that there was nowhere she could hide. Her heart would race every time she entered that classroom. The dread of another sarcastic remark, another glance, another joke about her. She began to feel like there was no place where she could find peace, no place where she could be safe. The classroom, a place she should have felt protected and supported, became a stage for her humiliation. The teacher, the very one who was supposed to protect her, became an active participant in her torment. It wasn't just the verbal abuse that broke her. It was the absence of help. Every time she would sit in silence, hoping someone would step in, hoping someone would say something, there was nothing. No teacher, no authority figure, no friend. Her pleas for help were ignored. The isolation became suffocating. The weight of the bullying, both from her classmates and from Mr. Fowler, began to take a toll on Sarah's mental health. She began to lose herself. She didn't see the point in trying to fight back anymore. Her self-worth, once something she took for granted, was now a distant memory. She couldn't remember the last time she felt good about herself, or the last time someone genuinely smiled at her. Not out of pity, but out of kindness. Every day felt like a battle, and every day she was losing. The stress, the constant humiliation, the crushing feeling of being invisible in a world that was so quick to judge. It all built up inside her. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't going to get better. No one was going to come to her rescue. No one would notice how much pain she was in. No one would see how broken she was becoming. Her isolation became her only constant, and the loneliness of it all was unbearable. The idea of escape became more tempting with each passing day, but she didn't know how to leave the world she was trapped in. By now, Sarah had stopped trying to explain herself. She stopped talking about the bullying. She didn't even cry anymore. She felt as if the world had given up on her. And for a while, so did she. Every day she walked through the same hallways, sat in the same classrooms, and lived in the same world, feeling as though she was suffocating. She thought maybe if she stayed quiet long enough, maybe if she endured just a little more, it would stop. But deep down, Sarah knew that it wouldn't. She knew that the cruelty would keep coming, that the bullying would continue, and that, eventually, she would break. It was a Tuesday morning, one that started like any other in the small town. The sun was shining through the classroom windows, and the usual sounds of students chatting and shuffling into their seats filled the halls. But for Sarah Cooper, that morning felt different. Her stomach twisted in knots as she walked into the school, a weight on her chest that felt like it was about to explode. Sarah wasn't the same person she had been yesterday. The torment had taken its toll. The sleepless nights, the constant dread of walking into school, the crushing self-doubt. It had all led to this moment. She had reached her breaking point. The school bell rang, and students filed into the classroom. Mr. Fowler, standing at the front of the room, looked just as he always did. Authoritative, confident, oblivious. He had no idea what was simmering beneath Sarah's silent exterior. She had walked into that room countless times before, but this time would be different. This time, the usual atmosphere of cruelty would be replaced by something far darker. Sarah sat at her usual desk, trying to keep her head down. Her hands were trembling, her palms slick with sweat. She had never felt more alone, more isolated. She could feel the tension building in her chest, but no one around her could sense it. No one could see how deeply the words had scarred her, how much the humiliation had chipped away at her ability to cope. Her mind was racing, but she forced herself to stay quiet. Her focus was on one thing and one thing only: getting through the day. But as the lesson began, it became clear that Sarah couldn't hold it together much longer. The whispering began again, this time louder, more deliberate. Her classmates were talking about her, laughing just out of earshot, making snide comments that she could hear all too clearly. Sarah tried to block it out, but she couldn't. It was as if the walls were closing in on her. Mr. Fowler turned to the board, explaining a lesson in his usual condescending tone. Sarah tried to focus on the words, but her mind kept racing. She could feel the humiliation starting to bubble up inside her again. She had tried to be quiet. She had tried to go unnoticed. But no matter how hard she tried, they always found her. And today, she wasn't sure how much longer she could take it. What happened next remains unclear. Was it premeditated? A moment of spontaneous rage? Or was it the result of years of accumulated pain? Some people said that Sarah snapped, that in one instant, everything inside her broke and she couldn't take it anymore. Others said the signs had been there all along. The days of growing silence, the loss of the spark in her eyes, the way she seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. As the seconds stretched into what felt like hours, Sarah's inner turmoil escalated. Her breathing quickened, her vision blurred. She looked down at her desk, her hand fumbling in her bag for something, anything to hold on to. That's when it happened. Without a word, Sarah pulled out the weapon. A kitchen knife, its blade gleaming coldly in the dim light of the classroom. It wasn't a random object. She had brought it with her, tucked deep inside her bag. For weeks, Sarah had felt the urge to do something, to act on the overwhelming sense of powerlessness that consumed her every day. She had fantasized about it, played out the scenario in her mind over and over. But now it was no longer a thought. It was real. As Mr. Fowler turned back to face the class, oblivious to the storm raging inside her, Sarah stood up. Her movements were shaky, her hands trembling, but she was determined. With one swift motion, the world as they knew it changed forever. Sarah's classmates didn't know what hit them. There was no warning, no screams, just the sickening sound of chaos. Mr. Fowler didn't even have a chance to react. The violence was quick, brutal, and unexpected. In an instant, everything went dark. Afterward, the classroom was eerily silent. Sarah didn't run. She didn't flee the scene as one might expect. Instead, she stood there, frozen. Her face was empty, devoid of expression, almost as if she had stepped out of herself, watching the horror unfold from a distance. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply waited for the inevitable. When the police arrived, it was clear that Sarah had no intention of escaping. She didn't resist when the officers placed her in handcuffs. In fact, she barely acknowledged them at all. There was no attempt to defend herself, no explanation, no remorse. Just a blank stare, as though she was disconnected from the reality of what she had done. As Sarah was escorted out of the school, her expression remained emotionless. The police had no answers for the media, only speculation. Was she in shock? Was she mentally unstable? Or was she a cold-blooded killer? The investigation into Sarah's actions began immediately, and soon, detectives were digging through the pieces of her life, trying to understand the motivations behind her violence. Witnesses who had been in the classroom during the attack were interviewed, and their accounts were chilling. They spoke of Sarah's sudden, intense shift in demeanor just before the violence erupted. One student recalled Sarah's eyes. They were vacant, distant, almost as if she had checked out completely. Another described her as quiet, like something was brewing beneath the surface. But no one could have predicted what happened next. No one had seen the breaking point coming, not even Sarah herself. In the wake of the attack, the question that loomed over the investigation was simple. Why? What had driven a quiet, seemingly normal teenager to take such drastic action? Was she a murderer, or was she a victim of the very system that had failed her? Psychologists were brought in to examine Sarah's mental state. They spoke about the psychological toll of years of bullying, the way it erodes a person's sense of self, and how, over time, it can lead to severe emotional breakdowns. But there was something more to Sarah's story. It wasn't just the bullying. It was also the sense of powerlessness that had consumed her for so long, the crushing belief that she had no control over her own life. Dr. Alicia Ramirez, a psychologist who had worked with many victims of bullying, explained the devastating psychological effects of constant abuse. It's like breaking someone's spirit, piece by piece. Bullying over an extended period of time can trigger depression, anxiety, and, in some cases, violent impulses. The victim begins to see themselves as worthless, as nothing more than the target of their tormentors. They lose all sense of agency, and that can lead to extreme measures. The investigation uncovered even more about Sarah's emotional state. Police found her journals, pages filled with despair, isolation, and frustration. In one particularly troubling entry, Sarah had written, "I can't do this anymore. I'm nobody. No one cares. They'll regret this." These words echoed the pain she had been carrying for so long, the years of unaddressed trauma that had festered until they boiled over. But even with this evidence, the question remained. Was this a premeditated murder? Or was it the tragic result of a broken teenager pushed beyond the breaking point? The authorities couldn't come to a definitive answer. The truth was messy, complicated, and difficult to piece together. What was clear, however, was that Sarah had reached the end of her rope. The years of suffering, of isolation, of torment, had culminated in a moment of violence that no one could have predicted. And then there was the weapon itself, a kitchen knife. It wasn't a random choice. Sarah had brought it with her. She didn't grab it impulsively in the heat of the moment. This was something she had planned, or at least something she had prepared for, whether consciously or unconsciously. But the question still lingered. Did Sarah know what she was doing? Was this a deliberate act, or had the years of psychological damage driven her to a place where she no longer had control over her actions? Detective John Williams, who led the investigation, said it best. The facts don't always make sense in these cases. People are complex, and sometimes the reasons behind these kinds of actions are too deep to understand right away. But one thing is clear: Sarah Cooper didn't just snap. She was a product of her environment, a product of years of abuse, neglect, and a failure to see the warning signs. The investigation continued, with more pieces of Sarah's story coming to light every day. But what was undeniable was this: something had broken inside her. And in that moment, everything that had been buried deep within her finally came to the surface. in the form of a tragic, violent explosion. The case quickly became a national spectacle, captivating the attention of people across the country. The courtroom was filled with media, reporters, and spectators who followed every development, eager to know the truth behind Sarah Cooper's violent outburst. But the question on everyone's mind wasn't just about the facts of the case. It was a moral question, one that seemed impossible to answer. Did Sarah deserve to be punished for what she had done? Or was she simply another victim of a broken system that failed to protect her? Sarah's defense team painted a clear picture. A young girl driven to the edge, pushed beyond her breaking point by years of relentless torment. They argued that this wasn't murder. It was the tragic outcome of a life ruined by bullying. Sarah wasn't a cold-blooded killer, they insisted. She was a victim of a society that didn't care, a society that failed to see the warning signs of her pain until it was too late. Sarah's defense attorney, in his most impassioned plea, stated, "This wasn't a deliberate act of malice. This was the breaking point. It was the result of years of torment, years of abuse. Sarah is a victim, not a criminal. She didn't choose this. She was forced into a corner, and when the pressure became too much, she lashed out." But the prosecution disagreed. They acknowledged the bullying, yes, but they made it clear that Sarah's actions were unforgivable. No matter the pain she had endured, the crime she committed could not be justified. She had taken a life. She had taken a teacher's life. And there had to be accountability for that, no matter the circumstances leading up to it. The prosecutor stood before the jury, eyes cold and firm. It doesn't matter how much she suffered. What matters is what she did. She ended a life, and for that, she must pay the price. As the trial progressed, emotions ran high. Sarah sat in the courtroom, her face an emotionless mask, but her eyes, those eyes, told a different story. She was consumed with regret, a mixture of sorrow and disbelief at what had transpired. Her face, once so full of fear and pain, now held the weight of her actions. Tears occasionally welled up in her eyes, though she never let them fall. She didn't look at anyone, didn't seek sympathy or comfort. She simply sat there, reflecting on what had brought her to this point. The jury deliberated for hours. Their decision was long in coming, and the tension was palpable. But when the verdict was finally announced, it sent a shockwave through the courtroom. Sarah was convicted of second-degree murder. The courtroom erupted into a mixture of gasps and murmurs. But even in that moment, there was no clear consensus on what the right answer was. Some believed that Sarah deserved leniency, that the years of abuse she had endured should factor into the sentencing. They argued that her crime was the result of a broken system, a failure of society to intervene when it mattered most. But others, just as vehemently, believed that no amount of torment could justify the taking of a life. For them, there were no excuses. Sarah's crime was unforgivable, no matter the circumstances that led up to it. As Sarah was led away from the courtroom, her parents, who had been sitting in the gallery, were left in shock and heartbreak. They had raised their daughter with love, always believing that she was simply a quiet, shy teenager, never imagining the depth of the pain she had been hiding. They couldn't understand how things had gotten so bad, how they had missed the signs. Had they failed her? Had they failed to see the emotional toll the bullying had taken on her, the years of mental anguish that had driven her to this point? The image of Sarah's parents, devastated and conflicted, lingered long after the courtroom doors closed. They were torn between love and disbelief, wondering what they could have done differently, questioning whether they should have seen the signs of Sarah's mental distress earlier. They couldn't escape the thought, could they have saved her? Or was this fate sealed long before the trial began? For the school, the aftermath was equally tragic. The halls that Sarah had once walked through now felt haunted by the very presence of what had transpired. The faculty and staff were left to pick up the pieces, grappling with the same question that had echoed throughout the investigation. How did they let it get this far? They had been entrusted with her safety, with her mental well-being, and yet they had failed to see the warning signs. The school, like so many others, had become a breeding ground for cruelty, where bullying was allowed to fester, and where students like Sarah slipped through the cracks. Sarah's life, once full of potential and promise, was now irrevocably changed. Her future, the one she had once imagined, was gone in an instant. As she sat in her prison cell, looking out the small, barred window, the weight of it all began to settle in. The empty space beyond the bars seemed to mirror the emptiness she felt inside. Her life would never be the same again. But even in that space, Sarah's mind wandered to the same question that had haunted everyone else involved. Who else was to blame? Was she simply another broken soul, someone whose suffering had been ignored until it led to tragedy? Or had society itself failed her? Was she a product of a system that couldn't protect her, a world that had abandoned her when she needed it most? In the end, the haunting truth is clear. Bullying can destroy lives, not just the victims, but everyone involved. It destroys families, it destroys communities, and it leaves scars that can never fully heal. Sarah Cooper's story is one of heartbreak and tragedy, but it is also a reminder of the profound consequences of ignoring the pain of others. For Sarah, for Mr. Fowler, for her classmates, and for everyone who came into contact with this tragedy, the consequences were far-reaching. And in the end, no one walked away untouched. What do you think? Was Sarah justified in her actions, or was there no excuse for what she did? This case raises so many difficult questions. Was she a victim of a broken system, or is there simply no excuse for taking a life? We want to hear from you. Was this a tragic moment of desperation, or was Sarah responsible for what happened that day? Did the years of bullying and torment lead her to an inevitable breaking point, or was this a calculated decision in a moment of rage? The complexity of this story makes it impossible to ignore, and we're asking you to weigh in. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Was Sarah a victim, a villain, or a product of the system that failed her? Your perspective is important, and this is a conversation we all need to have. Should justice take into account the mental and emotional toll of bullying, or should the consequences remain the same for everyone, regardless of their past? If the story struck a chord with you and you found it as chilling as we did, don't forget to like this video. Share it with your friends and family. Let's get the conversation going. And if you want to stay updated on more true crime stories that dive deep into the darkest corners of human nature, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell so you won't miss out on our latest videos, as we continue to uncover the truth behind some of the most shocking and thought-provoking cases. Your voice matters. Join the discussion and be part of uncovering the stories that leave us questioning everything we thought we knew.